Gute Woche and Shalom Aleichem and Aleichem Shalom. I was away for a week, and it was actually very encouraging to meet people in New York. Several people came over to say that they follow the recordings, and Baruch Hashem. So let's go down. First of all, we have a request for a refuah shlema for Nochem Ber Ben Malka. Things are progressing slowly, but it still needs Rachim Shemayim. And we also have better news from Shaul Ben Yocheved that Baruch Hashem things have stabilized. But again, we wish him a refuah shlema. That's Shaul Wilhelm the Shliach in Oslo. Let's start our shiur. So, for those who are listening, if they want to send in questions, the email address is dayan@lubavitchuk.com. And so now we'll go straight. I was walking on Shabbos morning somewhere in Crown Heights and some Empire Boulevard or whatever, and someone stops me and he says, I've got a shiur. So he says, what happens if someone ate some cake and also had some of the shiva saminim, of the fruits for which one would normally have to say alo eitz val priho eitz, and it came to, he said al hamichyo, and he forgot to include the fruit. Does he have to repeat the benching? So in other words, in the regular full benching, there's no detail. In Bar Nefoshes, there's no detail. In what we call Brocho Me'en Sholosh, we've got three options. We've got the detail of Al HaMichya Val Kalkala, for cake or pasta, etc. Or we have Al HaPeiros for Peiros Ha'oretz. And then we have the option of Al HaGefen. So how crucial is this detail? If you did not mention the detail, are you not Yotzer your bracha achrona? That is the question. So he was more of the persuasion that if he didn't say the detail, it doesn't matter. My initial reaction was that it does make a difference. It makes all the difference. So afterwards, I had the opportunity to look this up, and this is from the Sefer Piskei Teshuvos, which I've mentioned many times, and this is in Simaresh Ches. Sef Cotton Yotes Basic talks about mistakes in bracha achrona. So we can read that inside. Im ochal kamo minim v'shochach lahazkir kulam. Very much our question. One ate various species, and he forgot to enumerate all of them in the bracha achrona. So now, he in the footnotes compares this to, let's say, on Yom Tov, you can sometimes get carried away. If Yom Tov coincides with Shabbos, and if you did not say Mekadosh HaShabbos v'Yisrael v'Azmanim, you just said Yom Tov, are you Yotzer? So there we have a rule that if you mention Shabbos at any stage, then you would be Yotzer. And even though you did not mention it in the end of the bracha, if it was mentioned at any stage, so then you would be Yotzer. So he wants to use a similar idea for the bracha me'en shalosh. So let's read that further inside. Sorry. Im mitchilas habracha l'samach lechasimo. If at the beginning or towards the end, or in the ending, there's three slots where you mention Al Michya Val Kalkala or Al Peiros. So if you mention the specific one, at least one of those places, he does not need to repeat. If you realize the mistake before he said Baruch Atah Hashem, he should go back and say it right. But then he says, if he did not mention all details, neither in the psicha, not in the opening, not in the penultimate part, and not in the ultimate part of the bracha, then he's going to have to repeat. So again, if he'd said he had fruit and grapes, and he said al hamichyo, al kalkolo, and all the way through, do not mention peiros, well, then he's going to have to go back and say again, bracha achrona al hapeiros, al eitz val priho eitz and al hapeiros. The next piece is actually quite interesting, which in the Gemara, it says that wine has got a certain nourishing value similar to mezuzos. Also, of all fruit, tamri, dates, are also identified in Gemara as zaini, as they are nourishing. On that basis, he says here that if a person had wine and mezuzos and did not say al hagefen, but wine is included in mezuzos by a stretch. Similarly, if he had mezuzos and dates, so mezuzos, dates are by a stretch included in mezuzos, and therefore in those two cases you would not have to repeat the bracha achrona. In other cases you would. Okay, so this is, well, let's move on to the next question about a mezuzah. So someone sent me this question. We have a halacha in Shulchan Aruch that at what stage do you have to put up a mezuzah? So if it says here, Shulchan Aruch, that's the upper quote, if you are renting in Chutz La'aretz, if you are just in a hostel in Eretz Yisrael, you are exempt from mezuzah for the first 30 days. Whereas if you rent in Eretz Yisrael, then you are obliged to put a mezuzah immediately. Okay. The question here is, does leasing fall into the category of rental, or is leasing like a purchase? You can buy a lease for 99 years, whatever. Is that counted like a rent? Because in a way, it's not a freehold, it's just like a rental. On the other hand, it's long term. So really we need to go back to the question to understand, why is there the leniency? Why is there this leeway for the first 30 days not to have to put up a mezuzah? That's really what we have to analyze, and then that will answer our question. So some say it's because up till 30 days, the tenant is not so confident. He may terminate, may not be happy with a new move. So this is what this sefer, which I'm quoting here, is from someone called, it's called Oitzer Pische Mezuzah, something like that. Pische Shiurim. So there's two fellows, one of them called Schechter. It's an American sefer, but I'm going through Hilchos Mezuzah, and he writes, if you rented a house with a choizer, with a contract called a lease, since you cannot back out, Nero de Chayv Miyad, he takes the view that you do have to put up a mezuzah in immediately. So in a sense that a rental is a little bit of a question mark, but whereas if you have a lease, which is a long-term contract, then you're not going to back out so quickly. And as a result, it's the same as a purchase, and you do have to put up a mezuzah right away. He mentions a bit of a hesitation on that. I would just want to add another point. You know that the Minhag Chabad is, it's written from Minhagim, numerous letters of the Rebbe, that where even when renting, we put up a mezuzah immediately without a bracha, and then after 30 days, we take down one mezuzah, check it, possibly change it for a better one, and then make a bracha and have with that in mind all the others. That's the Minhag Chabad. Now, one of the reasons for this is not so well documented. One of the reasons for this is that the Shitas Harosh is that the exemption of 30 days doesn't mean the first 30 days of a long-term rental. It means if you are renting for up till 30 days. But if you are renting for a longer term rental, even let's say for 2 months, so then, or 31 days, so the Rosh says you chayiv mezuzah right away. So that's where Minhag Chabad is kind of the literal understanding of the Shulchan Aruch is that you have an exemption for the first 30 days. So in respect of that, we don't make a bracha when we put up mezuzah right away. But in recognition of the Shitas Harosh, we put up a mezuzah right away. So we should that we do have a mezuzah there. It goes to be even more interesting because if the first 30 days was an absolute exemption, if it was an absolute exemption, you can ask a question. You put up mezuzah, you have 10 doors in the house. You put up 10 mezuzos. At the end of 30 days, you took, without a bracha, yeah? At the end of 30 days, you took up one mezuzah to check it and replace it with a better one, whatever it may be. What about all the other mezuzos? They were put up. Why don't we say it's tasa v'lema also b'psul? If you were to chai b'mezuzah, then why don't you have to take up those mezuzos off and put them back again? So that's an interesting question. But now, if you're looking at it, it's more a how do you say? It's no pressure, so to speak. It doesn't mean that it's possible if it was put up during the first 30 days. So the poil, you don't have to take off the other mezuzos. You just take off the one and have the. It's in order to take a bracha. To make a bracha, you can't make a bracha. Just sit with your arms folded and say a bracha shegashalik mezuzah. You have to do a Maaser. So that's where you take one off. And what's your justification for taking it off? I mean, it's doing fine. So you take it off to check it. Perhaps put a better one. That's justifying taking it off and putting it back on again. And then once you're doing a Maaser, so then you can make a bracha, and that is covering for all the Mezuzos. Let's move on to the next question. Yeah. Okay. So on Sunday morning, last Sunday, I gave a shiur in Crown Heights. In actually the same shiur twice, two groups of people about Maaser of earnings. And one of the recites which we discussed, what can you do with your Maaser money? So of course, the primary usage of Maaser money is for tzedakah, but there is also permission to use it for a mitzvah need, so long as it's not a chiyuv on yourself. You're not absolutely bound to do that. So you cannot buy a mezuzah for with your Maaser money because you have mitzvah to put a mezuzah. You cannot buy an esrog and so on. You can't spend your Maaser money for things which is a chiyuv upon yourself. So, but if it's a hidur mitzvah, well, then it's voluntary. So then you could use possibly, and therefore they were asking the question, which I didn't answer at the time. You can buy an esrog for £50, but you want to have a fancier esrog. Can you use your Maaser money to pay the difference between a simple esrog and a mahudadika esrog? Because that extra amount is a hidur mitzvah, it's not a chiyuv. So Neibishter helped that, as in many things, we've got different opinions. And this sefer, which I have in front of you, is from a sefer called Psokim Utshuvos. Now, not to be confused with his father-in-law, who wrote a sefer Piskei Tshuvos. So the son-in-law is focused on Yehuda, has published so far 2 volumes, similar style, and they're called Psokim Utshuvos, and he has a section on tzedakah. So he writes the following: Yesh oimrim, there are those who say that even though you're not allowed to buy a personal mitzvah article with Maaser money, you could use the Maaser money for hidur mitzvah because you're not bound to do that. It's optional. And now there is an idea of hidur mitzvah ad shlish, that there is a kind of mitzvah, kind of a duty that you should allow yourself an extra third above the additional, above the basic price. So he says, for example, if you could have bought an esrog for $60, so then hidur mitzvah ad shlish means to spend another third, which means a third of 60 is 20. So you should be spending $80. But anything beyond 80 is considered not a chiyuv at all. And therefore, you would be allowed to use your Maaser money, anything beyond the 80. That's the first opinion. The second opinion says no. When we say that you can use Maaser money for voluntary mitzvahs, that's talking about putting someone else's mezuzah, things which are not for personal use. Let's read the words inside. Yesh oimrim, that this, or buying a more expensive esrog, would not be acceptable because it's an article which you're the sole user, like your tefillin, your arba minim. So to use your Maaser money for a hidur mitzvah, but you are the sole user, you shouldn't be using Maaser money. If it's a hidur, as I say, a voluntary mitzvah, but it's for the communal use, well, be shared, that's okay. But if it's just for yourself, that wouldn't carry, that wouldn't be acceptable. Okay. What then I would say there, if that's the case, if you are in a position that you're going to share your arba minim with numerous people, then it would be justified to use your Maaser money to up the quality of your esrog, which you're going to be sharing with members of your community, etc. Okay, let's move on. Okay, I've got this strange thing. I come to New York. There's a few times people have come over to me and observed how what I did when the Chazan started Shmone Esrei. I have a little problem that I didn't spend enough years in the reading class with the Rebbe Strauch of La Shalom, so I daven Shmone Esrei a little bit slower than the regular minyanim or my Pesukei Zimra. So it very often works out. Baruch Hashem, here we have a nice steady minyan with a steady pace, but there it's a bit quicker. So very often the Chazan is about to start Chazal Sashat, so now I'm about to start the quiet Shmone Esrei. So what do you do then? Do you daven together with the Chazan, or do you and then you say Kedusha, you kind of incorporate it in your davening, or do you wait do you wait there, say Kedusha, and then you start davening your quiet Shmone Esrei? By the way, Tosfos mentions that Rabbeinu Tam used to wait by shiur Hadosha. He used to wait there. Looks like the Minyan didn't wait for Rabbeinu Tam. In good company. So actually, before reading inside, someone noticed I waited. I didn't join to do a tandem ride with the Chazan. I told him actually I would have preferred to do a tandem, but I was worried, and I was actually, my worries were confirmed that this Chazan would say the Shmone Esrei so fast that I wouldn't be able to keep up with him during the first two brachas. So then I'd be, as they say, Korech Mikan and Mikan. I just try to stay with him. I can't keep up. And then, okay, but let's read this carefully. What are the options? All right, let's before addressing this, I just on the chat, someone raised the question: can you use Maaser money to buy tefillin for an einikul? Very good question. If you can't afford it otherwise, I think you could. If you can't afford it, and the einikul's family can't afford it from their regular funds, then you could use Maaser money. But if it's affordable without using Maaser money, then one shouldn't. Okay, so now here we have from the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch. This is in Siman Kuf Tes, and he writes the following: if you did start Shmone Esrei at the same time, for whatever pressure, you started Shmone Esrei together with the Chazan. So when you're saying Atar Giber together with the Chazan, and it comes to Knakdishach on a Kadesh, Ashkenaz. You're going to say every word which the Chazan says in tandem. In your quiet Shmone Esrei, you're not meant to be saying Kedusha. When you are saying in tandem with the Chazan, you're actually upgraded. You are a tandem Chazan. He says also you should say Akel HaKodesh together with him and Shemir Tefillah, and goes to the whole thing. Okay. Then he goes further. The second paragraph. This is only acceptable if you are urged to daven immediately, either because you already said Goal Yisrael, you have to start Shmone Esrei right away, or because it's getting late, and to wait till later you might actually miss Mount Tefillah, etc. But if it's not a pressure, if it's not a pressure, then you should not do this tandem job to say the Kedusha together with the Chazan. The fee, and this is where it's tricky. What the correct procedure would be You listen, the Chazan says, Nakdishach. Gentlemen, join us in sanctifying Hashem's name, Nakdishach of Naritza. And then, in response to the prompting of the Chazan, V'lanos acharov kodesh, Voruch v'yimlech bilvad. All we should be responding to the prompting of the Chazan are those three psukim, Kodesh, Baruch, and Yimlech. But the other bits we shouldn't be saying. When you're going to go in tandem with the Chazan, so you're going to always say those other bits too. And therefore, it's better to avoid this tandem arrangement. So now let's take a look at what the Alter Rebbe is saying. I've got on the page, I've got here two copies of Kedusha. One is from Siddur Torah Oir. The other one is from Siddur Tilas Hashem. So the Olam is more familiar with Tilas Hashem. So here, what he's saying is that the Chazan should be saying Nakdishach Til V'Korzel Zevi Omar, and the Kol the Chazan. Then we respond Kodesh, Kodesh, Kodesh. The Chazan says L'Umasam Meshabchim V'Yoimrim. We respond Baruch Hashem V'Yoimrim. The Chazan says V'Divrei Kodesh, and we respond Yimelech Hashem Lo. That is one minhag which is mentioned in Shulchan Aruch in I think Kuf Chof Hey, the Seder of Kedusha. As you see in the Torah Siddur, there's no instructions. If you look in Shulchan Aruch, so meanwhile, what the Alter Rebbe is saying is, these, if you're going to say in tandem with the Chazan, you're going to have to say L'Mosam Shabchim Oimrim. You're going to have to say V'Divrei Kodesh. Certainly, you have to say Nakdishach, and that's not the normal practice, and therefore better to wait before Shirach Hadosho and respond just those three psukim. In Siman Kuf Chof Hey, as I said, the Alter Rebbe brings a minhag Arizal to say all of this, to say Nakdishach as we all. That's the common minhag, or at least literature minhag, that everyone says Nakdishach. But if you go to Polish Medrash, you hear everyone's saying everyone's saying Divrei Kodesh. Actually, the Arizal had this minhag, but he'd said those things belachash. He would say Lumosam and Divrei Kodesh, he would say them belachash. There are those who say that the Rebbe would also follow that minhag Arizal to say those pieces of belachash. So therefore, to sum up, if you are saying all of these pieces, then there's no hesitation per se to do a tandem job with the Chazan. If you normally would not say those pieces, then that's where the Alter Rebbe says better not to say it with the Chazan, say and wait before Shirach Hadosha and say it. So really, it depends what your minhag is. If you would normally say everything, then there's no reason not to say it together with a tandem with the Chazan. But as I said just a few minutes ago, that's only if the Chazan and you are going to follow at the same pace. But if the Chazan is going to race ahead, then you may as well just wait and say just Kodesh Baruch and Yimlech and Omin Avakela Kodesh. A couple of points here. Someone is saying, I thought it's better mitzat tefillah b'tzibur to say. I think you're saying that it's better mitzat tefillah b'tzibur to say it together with the Chazan. That might be true. It sounds that answering is better than tefillah b'tzibur. So what we're seeing here is the Alter Rebbe is not so keen on it, but that's because of that minhag of not saying the pieces in Lo Mosam Shabchim Yoimrim and Divrei Kodesh. If you normally do say them, then yes, I think you're right. If the Chazan is not a rushing kind of guy, but is saying it patiently, as patient as you, then it would be better, I think, to say it together with the Chazan. Yeah. Okay. Now I had an email this week from, I was actually quite chuffed it was from Rabbi Broin, one of the senior rabbanim in Crown Heights. Was I noticed before, he's got an amazing recall, and he somehow had heard that I'd spoken about feeding pets. If you remember the discussion last week about was it 2 weeks ago, about the cat who would come every time the owner wanted to take a snack from the fridge. The cat was there also because it has a din kedima. And I mentioned that there's two Gemaras, one in Gemara Gittin and one in Gemara Brochus. One says you're not allowed to litoim, you're not allowed to taste before feeding your animal. The other one says also leasehold. And I pointed out that the Alter Rebbe brings the girsa also leasehold, and therefore it's only a meal, but just a little snack. You don't have to give priority to your cat. So he pointed out three references. One is in the Torah. There's actually a mimer in the Torah On the it's in Vayikra Mem Tes Amid base. On this, at the beginning of the Maimer is about not allowed to eat before feeding your animals, and then we have in the Likutei Torah we have this bracketed comment. These are most likely from the Tzemach Tzedek. We know that Tzemach Tzedek added many Hagos, and the Alter Rebbe had quoted the Lashon also litoim. So the Tzemach Tzedek comments that is indeed the Girsa in the Gemara Gittin Daf Samach Beis Amud Aleph, and that's also the quote in Mogen Avraham Kuf Samach Zayin. I think it's Kuf Samach Vav, whatever. Bes Yosef brings a Girsa Sheyochal, and that is indeed the Girsa in Brochos Daf Mem. So the Tzemach Tzedek has already pointed out this difference of whether it's also litoim or also lecho. And Rabbi Broin also gave me two other references. One is to Likutei Sichos Lamed Zayin, page 73 or 10. Another place in the Sikha, which I found in the Teres Menachem, volume Mem, page 298. So the change of the two Gersois is mentioned in all of these three places. I wrote to him, do you have any indication which way is more reliable? So he says, no, I just shared with you these Marmakomas, which he says, Kanira de Ishlamita say, and he was absolutely right. I didn't know those Marmakomas, but okay. Just to add, I had an extra smichus that the svara that since a cat can go and feed itself outside the house also, therefore you're not so bound to feed them before feeding yourself. And yeah, let's move on. Okay, that was 5, that was number 6. Okay, again I had a kliach somewhere in Florida, and the story is like this. They have a mikvah. This mikvah was built by a local Talmud Chochem, and it was a men's mikvah. But now they wanted to, for whatever reason, make it also kosher for mikvah for noshim. And so they brought out someone to check the mikvah, and the person raised a problem. The problem is, which he raised, is the siphon. In order to empty the mikvah, so they've installed a system. There's a pipe which goes down to the bottom of the mikvah, and it goes up over the sides of the mikvah, goes down to a well of some or drain which is lower than the bottom surface of the mikvah. And the way physics work is that the water starts draining out at the bottom of the siphon, although of this pipe, and that will make a suction and start emptying the mikvah. Now, in order to control that, so at the bottom end of the pipe, near the drain, there's a tap. So now there's two concerns here. One is a mikvah mustn't be leaking. A mikvah mustn't be zoichalim. It mustn't be flowing. The water has to be static. So I was quite comfortable to say that this water is static, it's not moving. There's another question, though, whether the water is being supported by Dover HaMakabel Tumah. In times bygone, mikvahs were built with a drain, a plug hole. Like you have in a bath, the bottom, there's a plug hole. So mikvahs were built that way, and but the problem is, how can you block that? If you're going to use a Dover HaMakabel Tumah, then it means the whole mikveh is being supported in place. The water is being supported in place by Dover HaMakabel Tumah, which is not okay. So they use a wooden bung or some other things. I only saw this once. I visited a mikveh in Germany. I don't remember, I think it was a place called Reutling or something, whatever. And they had a mikveh. I don't know how old it was, but there was actually a plug hole at the bottom of the mikveh. And that's the way they used to do that. And so the plug, which is plugging the outlet of the mikveh, that plug mustn't be a Dover HaMakabel Tumah. So now, is the siphon, the fact that the bottom of the siphon has got now a metal tap or a plastic, or whatever, it's a keli. Let's say it's a metal tap, just to make it for argument's sake. Does that make that the water in the mikvah is being supported by that tap? So I was not convinced at all about this being a problem, because I felt that the moment that water is not going anywhere, It's not even pushing. When you'll release the tap, then the first body of water at the bottom of the lower end of that pipe will empty out, and then it will create a suction. It'll create a vacuum and a suction, etc. But at the moment, there's no suction. It's just, it's sleeping. So I didn't feel there's any problem. But since someone raised the question, so I did write an email to Rabbi Eli Landau in Eretz Yisrael, and he confirmed that it is a concern. So I told the shliach we'll have to do something about it. But then afterwards, I had a bit of time. It was a bit of in a rush, so that's why I went that way. Now a bit of time. So what you have in front of you is from a sefer called Pischei Mikvos, which is written by Yaakov Bloy, who's written numerous brilliant sforim, Bris Yehuda, Chayvas Hador, Pischei Choshen. So he quotes here from a sefer Taras Yom Tov and a sefer Chesed Yehoshua. Taras Yom Tov was the Helmut Zero. The Chesed Yehoshua I did look up. It's a recent Hungarian Rov, where they talk about this suction, this siphon, and he describes how it works. And the Chesed Yehoshua says he doesn't see a problem of mamid through a makabel tumah, the fact that you use a tap, because the tap is only to stop the release of air, that they shouldn't start the siphoning. Yeah. So Rabbi Bloy writes in his brackets, Ktsas sorch iyun, she'ein ha'avir yotzei el al yidei mashicha. Ve'im ayri shekvar moshach v'ischilu ha'mayim lotzeis, im kein nirei shehu mayim midas ha'mayim shelo yetz. So his Rabbi Bloy is not so confident about this, and then the Taras Yom Tov is not happy about this. So what I'm seeing is that my initial position seems to be the same as what this Chesed Yeshua is saying, that at this moment there's no flowing, there's no suction, and therefore it's okay to have that tap there. But it's since in Mikva you try to do l'kulei alma, to avoid shilas. So this is what in the Sefer Pischei Mikvos he brings here from a Rav Mintzberg. He has a whole kuntras of a Rav Mintzberg who was a very involved in designing mikvahs, and they advised to do it the following. Same idea, that you have a suction and you have a pipe to the bottom of the mikvah, and there you have a little sump where the number 7 is, and you have the outside pipe goes lower than the surface, the bottom surface of the mikvah. But what you're going to have is at the top, where it has the number 4, you're going to have a tap. And when you open that tap, that's going to allow air into the system. When the air is in the system, then there's no suction. So then there's no pumping, no siphoning going to happen. When you want to empty the mikvah, you're going to close tap number 4. You'll then open tap number 2, and that will fill up the pipe all the way. You'll fill it up with water. Then you'll close tap number 2, and then nature will find its way that the bottom of the lower end of the pipe will start emptying, and it'll start sucking. So what this whole system of putting in an extra 2 taps, one air pipe, he calls it shoiver vacuum. He calls it to break the vacuum. So that's number 4. But to that, there shouldn't be a vacuum at all. And then once you do want to have a vacuum, you're pouring water through this number 2, and then the vacuum is going to start working. So I recommended that they should do this. But meanwhile, I asked, what can we use it until that's installed? I felt that it is valid. It's a kosher mikvah. That way it was built by whoever built it. It's a kosher mikvah, but you make it l'kulei alma. Let's take a look at, someone's put something on the notes here. Are you not supposed to say moedim and omein to shemei tefillah? So, okay, we're going back to, if you are not davening with the minyan, you're a bit behind, and you're holding by, as you say,
Shira Chadosha, etc. During Birchas Krishma, you may answer the three words of Moedem Anachnu Loch. You also answer Amen to the Bracha of Shema Tefillah. Does that mean you're going to have to wait? Sometimes you might be in a bit of pressure on time also to have to wait till the Chazan goes to Shema Tefillah and then to start your quiet Shmone Esrei. There may be something in that, but probably subject to how much time you have available. Let's move on.
Okay, so here I was at the Oyel on Wednesday morning, and someone saw me, a senior Rov, and he tells me that the last Shabbos, their 10th man disappeared during Kriyas HaTorah, and I'm going through this. It's probably some of our listeners have this from time to time, so it's worth revising the halacha. He's asking, should they have said Kaddish? So let's read. This is a quote from the Shari Ephraim. Shari Ephraim is a sefer which Shari Ephraim is a specialist sefer on Kriyas HaTorah. He writes the following: Ein kohen b'Torah at sheyusham asura anoshim Yisrael. You have to have 10 male adults, Jewish, and a child under the age of bar mitzvah doesn't make up your minyan. If you started with 10 men and one of them left, then you finish your quota of aliyahs. If it's a weekday, you do 3 aliyahs. If it's Shabbos, you do 7 aliyahs. If it's Yom Tov, you'll do 5 aliyahs with the brachas, but no hisafas, no extra aliyahs. But then it gets a little bit more interesting about maftir. You would not do a maftir. So what you're going to do is you're only going to have 7 aliyahs. The maftir is not going to be neither Shabbos nor Yom Tov. So I guess you wouldn't take out the other Sefer Torah for a maftir, or wouldn't open it for maftir. And you're just going to say Kaddish after Kriyas HaTorah, and Haftorah is considered a separate unit. As Haftorah is said without the brachas, but he does say you should say Kaddish after the Kriyas HaTorah. So that's like the end of the unit. The Kaddishes are considered at the end of the unit. In the notes in the Shari Ephraim, he does bring from the Birchei Yosef, from the Chidah, who is a little bit hesitant about that, but he himself obviously paskins that the Kaddish is part of the unit of Kriyas HaTorah, and therefore you would say that Kaddish. Okay. Fairly straightforward. I didn't have a chance to look up the whole machloikis of why the Birchei Yosef isn't concerned. I didn't manage to get around to it. Okay, so here we have a question which one of a kliach here in England actually asked me this week. He first asked, can you sell letters in a Sefer Torah to a prospective ger? So I answered yes. Then he says, what about an outright goy? Can you sell letters in a Sefer Torah? Now, really, the question here is, what does it mean when you sell letters of a Sefer Torah? I understand that if it's an ownership, I would be very loath to have a goy being a partner in a Sefer Torah. Even though perhaps Halocho it may be legitimate, I didn't find any clear indication. But is when you buy a letter in a Sefer Torah, what exactly is it? What are you doing? So we know that the Rebbe very much encouraged the union of buying a letter in the Sefer Torah, but it's an old Jewish minhag, and the Rebbe has a fascinating explanation. Now, if you want to know where it is, it's in Chutesichas Chov Dal in Parshas Vayelech. How are we Yotze? Most of us haven't written our own Sefer Torah and don't necessarily have plans to do so. So how are we Yotze the mitzvah? So the Rebbe says a fascinating explanation. When you have, let's say, back in the day where they only had one esrog for the whole town. So how did it work? The esrog has to be your own. You can't have a esrog in partnership. The answer is, the moment when you took the esrog, it's granted to you totally. So the Rebbe says a similar idea of Sefer Torah. What's the Sefer Torah for? Sefer Torah is for Kriyas HaTorah. So
the understanding is each person, as he has the Aliyah Torah, at that moment the Sefer Torah is his. So he has the ownership of the Sefer Torah for that moment, for those 2 minutes which he has his Aliyah. In that way, he owns the Sefer Torah. Now that's the Rebbe's Chiddush in that long Sikha, and towards the end he says the following: Mikol ha'omer le'el is echt verstandig der Gödel ha'inyan von keiner seiner Ois in a Sefer Torah shel hakol. Now we will appreciate how valuable it is, the idea to purchase a letter in a communal Sefer Torah. Demot is men yoitze de mitzvah, not nur mitzad lev bein der Bezdin Master. The Rebbe had used this concept that the Bezdin kind of allocate this. The Sefer Torah belongs to you at the time you have your Aliyah. Was das is moyel kanal, that the idea that you own the Sefer Torah at the time of your Aliyah, that is valuable, valid. Even if you haven't contributed, but the communal Sefer Torah is designed with the idea that each person as a user is theirs for those 2 minutes. But now, if you bought an os in the Sefer Torah, you've kind of done something, personally contributed to the mitzvah of writing the Sefer Torah. It's not like you're getting a mitzvah, just snatching it, a freebie. If you write a Sefer Torah, you are, it's as if you personally received it from Har Sinai. So, reading this, what is the Rebbe saying here? I don't think he's suggesting that you buy a letter, you are a partner. He's saying you are a contributor. If that's the case, if it's just a contribution, so then I don't have a strong objection to the guy buying a letter in Sefer Torah, but I certainly would not recommend it just out of hergish. But legally, strictly speaking, I don't have a strong objection, halacha. Now, whilst we're already talking about this, another shliach spoke to me during the week that he's got a donor for a Sefer Torah, and he's been offered a finished Sefer Torah. So now, when you want to do the dedication, normally you have people are called over and fill in the last letters. So the sofer, the soicher who sold in the Sefer Torah, he says there are those who allow you to erase some of the letters, and then you can give the honors to people to fill in. Which I felt I respect him. I think it's very inappropriate to start taking a kosher Sefer Torah, disqualifying it in order to dish out kibudim. I felt that was totally inappropriate. And you can give other kibudim, give hagbas and glilas and hagoshes and whatever. You can do kibudim without having to. My other hesitation was that if the person who you're going to give this honor is not in any way a Shomer Shabbos, then you have a problem. Whether he's filling in the letters is a kosher making, is it actually a kosher ksiva because of his status. In addition, bichlal, people go over and they take the pen and they start writing. Do you know what you're doing? You know, there's a difference between dropping a drop of ink and moving a pen. When you move a pen, that's called writing. If you take the quill and you just drop a drop of ink, that's not called writing. So in addition, it's such a complicated thing and I think it's just simpler. You have a kosher Sefer Torah. Don't try to be a chochem and get all of these people to write letters in the Sefer Torah. It raises problems. As you can see, I've got here from the Nite Gavriel, where he has a person who's not a Shomer Shabbos. One shouldn't really give them an opportunity to fill in letters of the Sefer Torah. And then he says, what happens if you have no choice about it? So you should, whatever, he gives you some advice. But really, it's something which is not a lechatchila at all. Okay, someone asking something on the chat. Many who write a Sefer Torah loan the Sefer Torah to the shul. Right. That's a very valid point. A couple of weeks ago, we did discuss that when you have a privately owned Sefer Torah, when they give it to the shul, they don't give it outright as a gift. They just lend it to the community. And so that's a very valuable point, that the Rebbe's Chiddush here, that there's a communal Sefer Torah. And whenever you have an Aliyah, you are acquiring the Sefer Torah for those 2 minutes of your Aliyah. That's only if it's a communal Sefer Torah. But if it's actually privately owned, so then you're right, you would not have the ownership for the time of the Aliyah. Yes, you could still have an Aliyah in someone else's Sefer Torah. But yes, you're right. This Chiddush of the Rebbe is only valid if it's a communal endeavor to write the Sefer Torah. Okay. Barrier Free wrote something about Sofras. Bichlal, when it comes to Sofras, I tended to try to shy away and say, go to the professionals. So I'm going to do that about your second chat. Let's go on. I had this very beautiful question from a young man somewhere in Ukraine or somewhere in the eastern, one of those countries. Email, and he writes in actually quite a good English. He writes that he tends to stay a few hours daily in shul. Does a bit of learning, it's for him there, but also he'll do some stuff probably on his phone, on his laptop, make some phone calls, and he's asking, is it okay to be doing these activities in the shul, these mundane activities, or should he move to the Ezras Noshim or somewhere else outside the shul? There's other rooms in the building. So his question is, to what degree of Kedusha, etc., my behavior in shul, how careful do I have to be? So let's take a look. Here we have in Shulchan Aruch Sim Kuflan Aleph in your Chaim, but you can see is about midrashes ein noyagim behem kalos reish. In a shul, one should not be behaving in a frivolous way. Schoik v'hitul, cracking jokes, sicha batela, yapping away. Ve'ein she'ochlim v'shoistim behem, nor to be eating and drinking. Meskashtim, to I don't know what that means. Putting on makeup, I don't know, whatever it may be. Ve'loi mitaylim behem, just unwinding. Ve'loi nichnosim behem v'chamo mipnei achamo. You shouldn't be using a shul as a shelter from the weather. Then he says the following: however, the scholars, they are allowed to eat and drink in the shul out of pressure, because otherwise it's going to be taking away, distracting them from their learning if they have to every time they want to have a drink or something to have to go out to the Beis HaMedrash. Therefore, they are allowed to eat and drink in the Beis HaMedrash. And then the others, there are more as Beis HaMedrash, even without pressure, it's also okay. Beis HaMedrash as distinct from a Beis HaKnesses. Then he says, you shouldn't be doing your accounts, your personal accounts, unless they are accounts of a mitzvah, tzedakah, pidyon shvuyim. All right. Now, of course, there could be the objection to the objection, and that is that our shuls are bichlal al tzanai. We have farbrengens in shuls, and our shuls don't have the full kedushas Beis HaKnesses. Fair enough. That's a valid point. Nevertheless, now I'm going over to the Piskei Teshuvos on that piece of Shulchan Aruch in Simon Kufran Aleph, and he says, "Bizmanenu yesh lahadgish." One should emphasize, one shouldn't be sitting reading newspapers, Haredi newspapers. In the Beis HaKnesses, Beis HaMedrash. Then he goes a whole thing about cell phones and smoking, and then he goes towards the bottom. He says a person shouldn't say I see many fine, upstanding members of the community who are not so particular about Beis HaKnesses, etc. So he says, so he does encourage to even in our contemporary types of shuls, to be careful and to be respectful of those premises. And so, yeah, so my advice to this young man is actually, yes, that if it's just ad hoc for a minute, but if it's going to be spending a while doing mundane stuff, then actually better not in the shul. Now, I told him I'm not sure about the status of the Ezras Noshim. Does the Ezras Noshim have the status of a shul? After all, it's also designated for prayer. The fact that it's not made for a minyanim, but I don't know that makes a difference. I remember there's something in Alter Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch and Hilchos Yom Kippur about sleeping in shul, about sleeping in the Ezes Noshim instead of in the Ezes Anoshim. I didn't have a chance to look at it more carefully. If it was the side room, which is nothing to do, which is not the Ezes Noshim, that obviously would be better. All right, my last thing which I want to share with you tonight, is on Tuesday night, I was at a chasana. Rabbi Levi Sudak married off his son. The chasana was in Monsey, and I was a bystander. So, all right. So for the Kedushin, you call up 2 witnesses. And then after the Kedushin is done, so then the ksuba is read. And then after the ksuba is read, the chosen gives it to the kala. And in some places, they have the minhag that's done in the presence of Adim, of the witnesses. So one of the witnesses had stepped down from the platform where the chuppah was taking place, and I asked him, "Are you not going to stay up to see the transfer of the ksuba?" So he says, "I don't know." I said, "Ask the Masada Kedushin." I said, "The Masada Kedushin said it's okay." Okay, fine. So here, my training is from the procedures a lot. I saw how Rabbi Shin Hackner Olav Shalom would do it, and he would be particular to get the witnesses to see the transfer of the ksuba. That doesn't mean that that's necessarily minhag Chabad, but that's what I was used to. So what I have here in front of you is from a sefer from Reb Mordechai Farkash, which is a madrich for Siddur Kiddushin. It's a manual for running a chasana. So he writes, after the reading of, now, by the way, why do you read the ksuba? Because a shtar, any document, before it is given over, it should be read. So, but a get, before it is signed, the witnesses read through the whole thing, and any document before it's signed should be actually read by the people who are going to sign it. So the reading of the ksuba is part of the we don't sign it then. Some people do. We don't sign it under the chuppah, but it's before the transfer of the ksuba. It's to be read. That's part of the procedure of documents. So then there's a separate issue. Tosfos in Psochim says that the reading of the ksuba creates a pause between the first part, which is the erusin, and that by priagofen, and the second part, which is the nisuin, and that's why, because we say twice by priagofen. And Tosfos says that the reading of the ksuba creates a hafsik. But let's come back. So after having read the ksuba is then given to the chassan, who gives it in turn, he gives it to the kala. There are those who hold that the reason for giving it over to the kala is to fulfill the opinion of the poskim, that a shtar is only got a validity when it's given over to the beneficiary of that shtar. So you have it signed, you have a signed document that so-and-so has committed so much money to so-and-so. But if it's not transmitted, if the document is not in the hands of the beneficiary, so then it's then the commitment hasn't happened yet. That's the svara which is being said here. Others say no. Once it's signed, it's already committed. Therefore, since there are those who say that there's no power to the shtar until it's actually transferred into the hands of the koine, therefore there are those who say that the edim should see the transfer, how the chosn gives it to the kala. And then is it recommended that the kala should then be giving it to someone else to look after for her, because the kala's got many other things to deal with besides holding on to the ksuba. And so usually we advise her to give it to someone else. Now, there we are. And he gives a reference to the tashbits. And then he said, many are not concerned about this. And he gives a reference. Also, Niti Gavriel says that most people are not concerned. But here I'm going to come back to the tashbits. The tashbits, his name was Rav Shimon ben Tzemach Duran, one of the late Rishonim. In my recollection, that Tzemach Tzedek quotes the tashbits. I didn't do a search, but he quotes him very, very often. Gives a lot of attention to this Sefer Tashbits. There's actually, to be careful, there's 2 svarim called Tashbits. One is this Reb Shimon ben Tzemach, and then one is, I think, Reb Sheshes ben Tzodek. There's a Sefer Tashbits called Tashbits Cotton, a small Sefer of Minhagim. And then we've got the Shuvas Tashbits, which we have over here, both connected to Parshas Truma, because we have the Kseidas Tashbitz. Well, it's actually Parshas Tetzaveh. But their names are both Shin ben Tzadik. So in the Tashbitz, Siman Shin Aleph and Chelik Gimel, he has a long, several pages, long tshuva of several pages, going through the Ksuba and explaining kind of phrase by phrase what's the significance of that phrase. But then he writes the following. It doesn't say anywhere in the Ksuba that kosavnu v'chosamnu v'mosarnu. The witnesses do not affirm that they've given over. Avol nohagu shehachosen moise b'yad akalo b'fnei ho'edim haKsuba. He writes that the custom is that the chosen gives it over to the kala. Now, then on the second column, then the Tashbitz writes, for the actual main body of the Ksuba, the main fund, the main commitment of the Ksuba, there's no need to have giving it over to the Kala, because Tanai Bezdinu, and even if you hadn't written the Ksuba, the commitment, it's Bezdin have applied that duty to give it in any case. And then he says, Nidunya, that has already become owned or committed from the moment of the Kinyan. But then he says, Avol le'inyan toisfus, shehi matana. But you have in the ksuba, there's various elements. There's the main ksuba, there's a dunya, and then there's toisfus. So he says that is called matana, and that doesn't become hers until she gets the shtar. And therefore, lefi da'azoi, then the minik to give over the ksuba b'fnei ha'edim from the chosen to the kala. And then he goes on. He says it's machlokas between the Rif and the Rambam and others Rishonim. And he says, in order to take heed of the Rif and Rambam's position, therefore the minig is to give it from in front of Edim into the hand of the Kala. As I said, this is not universal, and in some places the Chosen doesn't give it to the Kala at all. Sometimes it's given to someone else, one of the family. So it's not universal, as I mentioned over here also. It's not a universal minig. But on the other hand, there is ample yisoid and mocker for it. It should be done, and obviously a minig in some places. And so, yes, it's not a minig shel shtus. It's got a very good yisod that one should be giving it over for the chosen to the kala. All right, we'll stop with that, and just finish off something which I didn't manage to digest properly, but I still want to share it with you. The Sikha, which was published for this week from Yud Shvat Tovshin Lamed Hey, has a little discussion in I think Sif Lamed Gimel. Is it Mlava Malka? Is it with an aleph or with a hey? Is it the king or the queen? And he has there a few references, and the Rebbe explains the two sides of it about the Indian of Melech and Malka. What exactly is Shabbos? Because by Lechadoidi we say Shabbos Malkasa, but then we have in Alter Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch in Hilchos Mlava Malka and Siman Shein, he says Lavi says HaMelech. And so there are a few places in the Rebbe Sichos where he addresses this question: are we referring to the Shabbos as a Melech or as a Malka? But as I say, I didn't manage to absorb the Rebbe's explanation over here, and so I'll leave you with the undigested reference. And I wish you all a gute Woche, and we zal zich treffen gezondheid. Kaltef.
Amen.
Many thanks.